It had only been a day since Jessica's burial, and the air still carried the weight of her loss. Jessica was my childhood friend, the type of person who lived life in overdrive, never slowing down long enough to breathe. She was consumed by stress, a perpetual state of motion, fueled by anxiety and overthinking. On a good night, she might have managed 4 hours of sleep, though even then she'd wake up in the middle of the night, scribbling notes about things she might have missed or forgotten. Every decision she made was double and triple checked, every outcome meticulously planned. She used to say, "If I don't overthink it, who will?" Her need for control wasn't just a quirk, it was a survival mechanism. Jessica grew up in a household where mistakes weren't just frowned upon, they were punished. It made her hypervigilant, always second-guessing herself, always striving for perfection. The toll it took was obvious to those who knew her well. The dark circles under her eyes, the nervous tapping of her fingers, the way she'd pace endlessly when something was out of her control. But on her wedding day, she decided to let go. She told me as much. Today is going to be perfect. No stress, no worrying. I'm letting go. Just for once. She laughed when she said it, but the way she looked at me made it clear she needed reassurance. "You've got everything under control, right?" she asked, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic fragility. I had one job that day, to oversee the sound system setup for the ceremony. Jessica was notoriously particular about the music, down to the order of songs and the timing of every cue. She had spent weeks perfecting the playlist and ensuring that each song carried the exact emotional weight she wanted. "I'm counting on you to make sure everything's perfect," she told me, handing me the list and trusting me to ensure the system was flawless. It was a rare moment of trust from her, something she never gave lightly. But in the chaos of the morning, I got distracted. The sound system cables hadn't been secured properly, and I assumed everything was fine without double-checking. I was scrambling to fix a last-minute issue when the ceremony began. During the vows, as Jessica moved beneath the floral arch, one of the unsecured cables snagged and pulled on the structure. The arch collapsed with a sickening crack, and a jagged beam struck her neck. No one saw it coming. The image of her lifeless body, her dress soaked red, her head severed, haunts me. Her last words to me echo constantly, "I'm counting on you." And I failed her in the worst way imaginable. The irony is unbearable. The only time Jessica truly rested, the only time she didn't overthink every detail, was the moment that cost her everything. The burial was a blur of sobbing faces and hushed voices, all muffled by the heavy weight of grief. Her parents clung to each other, their faces pale and drawn, while friends and family crowded the gravesite, each person carrying their own version of Jessica's tragedy. Her husband was devastated. The priest's words floated in the air, hollow and distant, as if they belonged to someone else's story. I stood at the edge of the gathering, feeling like an imposter. Guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the part I'd played in her death. Everyone around me mourned the loss of Jessica, the vibrant, loving woman they remembered. But all I could think about was the mistake I hadn't admitted to, the loose cables I hadn't checked, the moment I'd let her down. Tears welled up in my eyes, but they weren't for the same reasons as everyone else's. I wasn't just mourning Jessica, I was mourning my own failure. Every glance from her family felt like an accusation, though they had no idea. They didn't know that I was the reason she was gone, and I couldn't bring myself to tell them. Her casket was lowered into the ground, the finality of it hitting me like a punch to the chest. I wanted to say something, to confess, to beg for forgiveness. but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stayed silent, letting the guilt fester as the first shovelful of dirt hit the casket. As the crowd began to disperse, her mother approached me. Her voice was soft, her eyes searching. "Jessica trusted you so much," she said. "She talked about you often. I know you must be hurting too." I nodded, unable to meet her gaze. The weight of her words pressed down on me, and I swallowed hard to keep from breaking down. "She was amazing," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Her mother placed a hand on my shoulder, offering a small, sad smile before walking away. The gesture felt like forgiveness I didn't deserve. I stayed behind after everyone else had left, staring at the freshly turned earth. I couldn't bring myself to leave. My mistake had put her here, and now I was tethered to this place, unable to move forward. I didn't plan to visit her grave the day after her burial. The weight of my guilt, heavy as it was, had already made me feel unwelcome among the mourners. Now, standing here, it felt like an intrusion. But the pull was irresistible. Unfinished business, whispered accusations I couldn't escape, had brought me back. The guilt clung to me like a second skin, dragging me to her resting place. The graveyard was silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every sound. The crunch of my shoes on the gravel path echoed unnaturally loud, as if even the ground disapproved of my presence. I walked slowly, my chest tight, until her headstone came into view. Her name was etched there, in clean, simple letters. Jessica Harper, beloved daughter, friend, bride. The word bride hit me hardest. It wasn't just a title. It was a symbol of everything she had hoped for and everything she'd lost. Fresh flowers lay at the base of the grave, probably left by her parents earlier in the day. I hadn't brought anything. I stood there, empty-handed, feeling even more out of place. My thoughts raced as I stared at the freshly turned earth. How do you apologize to someone who can't hear you? How do you fix what can't be undone? The questions battered my mind, each one heavier than the last. I knelt down and tried to find the words. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to her or to myself. "I should have been more careful. I should have." My voice broke, and I fell silent. The graveyard remained indifferent. The breeze rustled the leaves, and somewhere in the distance a crow cawed. But there was no sign, no acknowledgement of my guilt, just the cold, silent reality of her absence. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. My knees ached as I straightened, and I took one last look at the grave. "I'll do better," I said, though I didn't know what that meant or if it even mattered. Then, with heavy steps, I turned and walked away. When I returned home, the atmosphere felt oppressive. The air was heavy, almost stifling, carrying a faint smell of dust mingled with something sharper, a metallic tang of decay. My steps faltered as I pushed the door open, the familiar space of my home now feeling alien. It was only when I stepped into the kitchen that I saw it, and I froze. There on the center of the table was a box, a small weathered box that hadn't been there before. Its surface was faded with age, its brass hinges dulled. But what struck me most was its placement. The box was perfectly aligned with the edges of the table, the kind of deliberate precision that seemed almost obsessive. It wasn't just placed, it was arranged, as if someone meticulous had spent careful moments ensuring it was exactly right. The longer I stared at the box, the more I felt like it was accusing me. There was no other explanation for its presence. It was waiting for me, left deliberately by someone that knew I'd find it. The air in the room seemed to press against my chest as my mind raced. Who had put it here? How had they even entered? Every instinct screamed at me to turn and leave, but my body didn't listen. My hand shook as I reached out, my fingers brushing the rough surface of the lid. The brass hinges gave a soft groan as I lifted it, the sound loud and unnatural in the suffocating silence of the house. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might stop. Inside was her head. Jessica's face stared back at me, her dark circled eyes glassy and unblinking. Her features were untouched by decay, preserved with an almost horrifying perfection. The exhaustion she had carried in life was still etched into every line and shadow of her face, as though even death couldn't release her from its grip. Her lips were parted slightly, and for a moment, it looked as though she might speak. The sight was grotesque, unbearable, and yet I couldn't look away. A strangled gasp escaped me, and the box slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. I staggered back, my legs giving way as I crashed against the wall and slid to the floor. Panic clutched at my chest, my breaths coming in ragged, shallow bursts as the room began to tilt and warp. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, creeping toward me, and the air seemed to hum with an oppressive energy. When I finally dared to open my eyes again, the head was gone. The box lay on its side, its lid ajar as though mocking me. Inside was nothing but an aged piece of paper folded neatly, its edges yellowed with time. Trembling, I crawled forward on unsteady hands and knees, each movement heavy with dread. My fingers hesitated before picking up the paper, its weight insignificant compared to the crushing fear pressing down on me. I unfolded it slowly, the faint crackle of the paper breaking the suffocating silence. The note was folded with a precision that matched the placement of the box itself. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, the paper crackling softly in the silence of the room. The text was typed, bold and unyielding. It read, "I trusted you." The words hit me like a blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I read them over and over, their meaning sinking in like cold water. Each letter seemed to scream at me, accusing, condemning. The message wasn't just a statement. It was a reminder of the trust I'd broken, the mistake that had cost Jessica her life. As I stared at the note, the air around me seemed to shift. The faint smell of decay grew stronger, seeping into my nostrils until it was all I could smell. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, warping the edges of my vision. Then I heard it, a faint sound breaking the silence. A whisper, soft and raspy, carrying my name like a curse. I dropped the note, my hand shaking violently, and scrambled back. My pulse raced, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The whisper grew louder, circling me until it felt like the walls themselves were speaking. Then, all at once, the sound stopped. The room fell silent, but the oppressive feeling lingered. It wrapped around me like a suffocating shroud, heavy and inescapable. My skin prickled, every hair on my body standing on end. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. Grabbing my jacket, I bolted out of the apartment and into the cold night air. The chill hit me like a slap, sharp and unforgiving, but it didn't stop the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers had stopped, but their weight lingered, a phantom pressure that kept me looking over my shoulder as I walked aimlessly down the empty streets. The city was silent, unnaturally so, as if the world itself had paused to hold its breath. Streetlights flickered as I passed, their faint hum adding to the eerie atmosphere. My steps echoed against the buildings, each sound bouncing back to me like a warning. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, dark figures shifting at the edges of my vision. But when I turned, there was nothing. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and that apartment as possible. My feet carried me to a park I hadn't visited in years. The rustling of leaves in the breeze was the only sound, a fragile reminder of normalcy in a night that felt anything but. I found a bench near the edge of the park and sank onto it, my body trembling. My breaths were shallow, my chest tight as if I couldn't take in enough air. I pressed my hands against my face, trying to steady myself. But the image of the note, those words, burned behind my closed eyes. "I trusted you," her voice whispered in my mind, clear and mournful. It wasn't an accusation this time. It was something deeper, a lament that carried a weight I couldn't bear. I opened my eyes, half expecting to see her standing in the shadows, but the park was empty. The branches overhead swayed gently, casting shifting patterns of light and darkness across the ground. I stayed there for hours, unable to move, unable to think of anything but the trust I'd broken. The night stretched on endlessly, and with it, so did my torment. After wandering the streets for hours, I finally returned home. The night air clung to me, chilling my skin, but the sight of my apartment did little to comfort me. If anything, stepping inside felt like walking into a trap. The oppressive weight I'd felt all evening hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown heavier. The moment I entered, I froze. The table where the box and the note had been was now empty. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no sign of the box, no letter, no evidence of the horrifying discovery I'd made just hours before. Had it really happened? Had I imagined everything? The questions churned in my mind, twisting my thoughts into knots. But I knew the answer. Deep down, I knew. I locked the door behind me and turned on every light in the apartment one after the other. Each bulb buzzed faintly, casting pale illumination that did little to soothe my nerves. I checked every corner, every closet, under the bed. Nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, as though something unseen was waiting, just out of sight. I sat on the couch, staring at the empty table, trying to make sense of it all. My thoughts spiraled, looping back to that single phrase, "I trusted you." It played over and over in my head, each repetition twisting the knife of guilt deeper into my chest. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Exhaustion tugged at my body, but fear kept me awake. I'd spent the entire day in a state of dread, and my mind was fraying at the edges. Still, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Not yet. By 2 a.m., I couldn't fight it anymore. My body was too tired, my thoughts too scattered. "Just a little sleep," I whispered to myself, as though saying it aloud would make it safe. I dragged myself to the bedroom, leaving all the lights on as I went. Crawling into bed, I kept the bedside lamp on, the warm glow washing over the room. My heart raced as I closed my eyes, but the pull of sleep was too strong to resist. I drifted off into a restless, dreamless slumber. I woke to a horrifying sight. The room was pitch black, and above me, suspended in the suffocating darkness, was a head. I couldn't tell if it was Jessica's. The features were too faint, too shrouded in shadow, but the glowing outline of its mouth and eyes was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I could barely make out her mouth and eyes in the shadows, faintly glowing and unblinking. The outline of her features was just enough to send a shiver down my spine, the weight of her presence pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. My breath caught in my throat as my body locked in place. Paralyzed by fear, I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My heart hammered in my chest, my mind racing with panic. I could barely think, barely breathe. The head didn't move, didn't blink. It simply watched, its presence as chilling as the void itself. Summoning every ounce of willpower I had, I lunged for the lamp, slamming my hand against it. The light flickered on, flooding the room with warmth and banishing the darkness. I gasped for air, sitting upright and clutching the blanket to my chest. The room was empty. No head, no shadows, nothing but the sound of my ragged breathing filling the silence. My eyes darted around, searching every corner, every surface, but there was no sign of her. I didn't sleep again that night. Instead, I sat in bed with the lamp on, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning, waiting for an end that I knew wouldn't come. The days following that night were unbearable. Sleep had become a distant memory, something I no longer trusted myself to indulge in. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it. That suffocating gaze pressing down on me, waiting to return. The head hadn't appeared again, but the anticipation was worse than the reality. I knew it was only a matter of time. Then, it happened again. It was mid-afternoon and I was getting ready to go outside. I opened the closet to grab my jacket, and there it was. The head sat perched on the top shelf, wedged between a pair of old shoes and a forgotten box of winter scarves. Its faintly glowing eyes were locked onto mine, the mouth barely visible but unmistakably there. My blood ran cold, and I froze. My hand was still on the closet door, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I slammed the door shut with such force that the sound echoed through the apartment. My heart pounded as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. When I worked up the courage to open the door again, the head was gone. The closet was just as it had been, filled with jackets and forgotten clutter, as though nothing had ever been there. But I knew what I'd seen. The second time was in the bathroom. I had just finished brushing my teeth when I leaned down to spit in the sink. When I looked up, I froze. Behind me, partially hidden by the folds of the shower curtain, was a head. Half of it was visible, peeking out just enough for the faintly glowing eyes to bore into me through the mirror. I couldn't tell if it was smiling or grimacing, but the intensity of its presence was suffocating. My body went rigid, and for a moment, I couldn't even turn away. The sound of water dripping snapped me out of it, and I spun around, my hand clutching the edge of the sink for support. Nothing. The shower curtain hung limply, swaying slightly as though mocking me. The bathroom was empty. The mirror showed only my pale, trembling reflection. The third time, it was late at night. I'd been sitting on the couch, trying to lose myself in a movie, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her, to the box, to the note, to the head. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye made me turn, and there it was, sitting on the armrest of the couch, staring at me with the same faintly glowing eyes. I screamed and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the door, waiting for... what? For it to knock? For it to burst through? But the silence stretched on. When I finally gathered the courage to open the door again, the head was gone. The room was empty, the movie still playing on the television, oblivious to my panic. I stopped talking to people about what I was going through. Not that I had told anyone much to begin with. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what could they do? The guilt I carried weighed me down like an anchor, and I couldn't bring myself to share it. This was my burden, my punishment, and I had to bear it alone. Over time, the appearances became less frequent, but the damage had already been done. Ironically enough, I had become just like Jessica. My life revolved around overthinking and relentless preparation, every action governed by paranoia. I had started triple-checking everything in my apartment, every door, every drawer, every shadowy corner. I kept the lights on at all hours, the glow of the bulbs becoming my only comfort. But even then I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching, waiting. My paranoia consumed me. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. On a good night, I managed 4 hours, if I was lucky. My body began to betray me, exhaustion setting in, my nerves constantly on edge. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sent my heart racing. I lived in fear of her return, and that fear controlled every aspect of my life. 10 years had passed since the haunting began, and though the visions of the head had long stopped, their scars remained. Life hadn't returned to normal. Not really. The paranoia lingered, creeping into every decision I made, every action I took. I still triple-checked locks, inspected shadows, and avoided mirrors when I could. Jessica's ghost no longer haunted me, but the fear she left behind had embedded itself deep into my soul. I had found someone, though, Olivia. For 6 years, she'd been my anchor, the only person who could calm my ever-racing mind. She never pressed me for the details of my nightmares, though I knew she noticed the toll they took. The sleepless nights, the horrific bags under my eyes, the way my hands trembled when I'd catch a glimpse of something that wasn't there. She was patient, steady, the kind of person who could endure the storm of my paranoia, and I loved her for it. Despite everything, I was finally ready to move forward, ready to build a life with her. Marriage had always seemed impossible to me, a cruel echo of what had happened before. But Olivia was different. She gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, I could leave the past behind. The nightmares hadn't completely disappeared, though. They still crept in when I was at my weakest, pulling me back into that suffocating darkness. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my chest tight, the ghost of glowing eyes staring at me from the void. On a good night, I managed 4 hours of sleep, a cruel mirror of the rest Jessica used to get in her tormented life. On the bad nights, I didn't sleep at all. Instead, I'd sit in the dim light of the living room, staring at nothing, my mind racing with what-ifs. But slowly, things started to change. Piece by piece, moment by moment, I began clawing my way back to something like normalcy. Recently, for the first time in 10 years, I had a night where I slept 7 full hours. 7 hours of uninterrupted, dreamless sleep. It felt like a gift, a small victory in the war I'd been waging with myself. Olivia didn't say much about it, but I could see the concern in her eyes beginning to soften into hope. She'd touch my face gently, tracing the deep lines that had formed over the years, and tell me she was proud of me, proud of how far I'd come. It helped, more than I could put into words. Now I was finally ready to move forward, ready to leave the nightmares behind and start a new chapter of my life. I was ready to marry Olivia. The week before the wedding was the hardest. Every fear, every paranoid thought came rushing back like a tidal wave. I obsessed over every detail, the flowers, the guest list, the weather forecast. The floral arch became my fixation. It had to be perfect, stable, unshakable. I spent hours inspecting it, tightening every bolt, reinforcing every beam. I couldn't let history repeat itself. I wouldn't. "You're going to make yourself sick," Olivia said one night, watching me as I scribbled notes in a journal full of backup plans and contingency lists. "I can't help it," I replied, not looking up. "I have to make sure everything is right." She sighed and knelt beside me, her hand resting on mine. "Everything is going to be fine. You've done everything you can. Trust me." Trust. The word made my chest tighten. I hadn't trusted anyone with anything important in years. But Olivia was different. She deserved my trust. She deserved better than the man I'd become. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, going over every detail again, triple-checking the plans. By 2 a.m., I was running on pure adrenaline. My body was screaming for rest, but my mind refused to let go. There was one last detail to handle: the alignment of the floral arch. I'd inspected it earlier, but my mind wouldn't let me shake the thought that it wasn't perfect. Maybe one of the bolts wasn't tight enough, or the placement wasn't quite right. The thought of it collapsing during the ceremony gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the fear that I'd overlooked something crucial. David, my best man, saw the state I was in and pulled me aside. "You need to stop," he said firmly. "Get some sleep. I'll check the arch and make sure it's perfect." "But," I started, the words catching in my throat. "No," he interrupted, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You've done enough. I'll go over every bolt, every beam, and make sure it's solid. You've trusted me with a lot over the years, haven't you? Trust me with this. You need to rest, or you'll be a wreck tomorrow." His words hit me harder than I expected. Trust. The very thing I'd struggled with for so long. But David's steady, confident tone broke through the fog of my anxiety. He was right. I'd known him for years, relied on him in countless ways. I could trust him now. I hesitated for a moment longer, the word trust echoing in my mind like a warning and a lifeline all at once. Then finally I nodded. "Thank you," I said quietly. David smiled. "I've got this. Now go get some sleep." For the first time in years, I let someone else handle something important. It wasn't easy, but the exhaustion in my body left me little choice. For the first time in years, I closed my eyes and slept deeply. Tomorrow was going to be perfect. It had to be. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. For the first time in years, I woke up feeling calm and rested. There was a strange calmness in the air, a quiet assurance that everything was going to be fine. The doubts and fears that had plagued me for so long seemed distant, muffled by the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the window. I dressed carefully, making sure every detail was perfect. Today wasn't just about me. It was about Olivia. She deserved nothing less than the best. Guests began to arrive as the afternoon rolled on, their cheerful chatter filling the air. The venue was beautiful, everything I'd hoped for and more. The floral arch stood tall and proud at the end of the aisle, its blossoms radiant under the golden light of the sun. I felt a twinge of pride, knowing how much effort had gone into making this day perfect. David caught my eye as I adjusted my tie. He gave me a thumbs up, a silent reassurance that everything was as it should be. I nodded back, grateful for his help. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to relax, even if just for a moment. The ceremony began. Olivia walked down the aisle, her smile radiant and eyes glistening with tears of joy. My heart swelled as I watched her approach, her dress flowing gracefully with each step. The world seemed to blur around her. She was the only thing that mattered. We stood together beneath the arch, exchanging vows that spoke of love, hope, and a future I could finally believe in. The officiant's voice was steady and calm, guiding us through the promises we made to one another. The crowd was silent, their attention rapt. As the officiant spoke the words that would seal our union, a faint groan sounded above us. My chest tightened as I looked up. The floral arch began to tilt. The supports buckled, and the blossoms shook loose as the entire structure shifted toward me. Time slowed as the beam above swayed ominously. My eyes widened in horror as the structure collapsed toward me, its weight bearing down toward my neck.